And here to give us some tips about collect calling, Carrot Top.
You moron, that's a Carrot's Top.
Just dial down the center with 1-800-CALL-ATT for collect calls.
When we think of Cartoon Network, we think of a veritable parade of diverse characters from an eclectic lineup of creators and sources. At least we did before whatever's going on now. But before all of that, we owed some of the culture's most earth-shaking animation to CN. From would-be global phenomenon like the Powerpuff Girls to lesser-known but beloved cult classics like Flapjack, genre-defining epics like Samurai Jack, up to the stoner-like humor of Regular Show. But before we had that 50-flavor menu of a cartoon for every palate, CN's beginnings were rather humble. The earliest Cartoon Network programming was reruns. The channel was home for a massive archive of several retro ensembles, to the effect of Looney Tunes and largely Hanna-Barbera. Ambition grew among the minds at Cartoon Network, congruent with a need for further funding. Here was downright fertile ground for collaboration and advertising, and for a long time all it was for was 24/7 Huckleberry Hound reruns. The fact is, CN was stuck in an early evolution that was just exceeded by their big rival, Nickelodeon. After breaking out of their own awkward dumping ground phase of repackaged British and Canadian shows, they finally amassed funding for bold original cartoons, the first ever Nicktoons. And unfortunately, the divide in appeal was beyond clear. Cartoon Network had its audience, but up against the daring creativity radiating from the works of Ren and Stimpy and the Rugrats, there was just no comparison. They had budgets that showed on the screen in spades, and thrived on slapstick and chaos, with their finger on the pulse of their audience. How many 90s kids would really have an appreciation for a character whose joke is that he's a shark that sounds like Curly Howard? Action cartoons were in a similar place. This was during a point where X-Men and Batman had animated series that dazzled audiences of every age. Compare that to Cartoon Network superheroes at the time, who had aged and limited animation to deal with, and inescapably far more simplistic writing. When we had the auteur-driven superhero cartoons of the 90s, who would want to watch Blue Falcon, or Thundar, or Space Ghost? Well, put a pin in that one. As Cartoon Network's rivals developed an embarrassment of riches with an increasingly ubiquitous library, it was clear what they needed to close that gap. They needed a show with some degree of edge, someone who could draw in fans of the surreal and sometimes shocking Nicktoons in a way the deferential likes of Yankee Doodle couldn't. But it was the alienation of modern audiences that barred CN from funding a bold new creation like the Nicktoons. The big issue was sort of a self-consuming Ouroboros of a lack of money for new IP and creations, and lack of IP and creations to generate money. The challenge would be met by a huge innovation begotten by an iconoclastic show that would change everything: Space Ghost, Coast to Coast.
My next guest is Weird Al Yankovic. Here he comes now.
Hi, people of the universe. Look at me, I'm on TV. Woo!
Woo! Woo!
Thank you. I can't tell you what an intense thrill it is to be on your show.
Sure you could.
TV programmer Mike Lazo created the strange show that sewed together genres of animated comedy, cartoon repackage, and of all things, late-night talk shows in a Frankensteinish method. With extremely little budget, but the sort of piecemeal inclination was a huge part of the charm, and it begot this strange but delightful hodgepodge of pop culture needling, cartoon nostalgia, and far-out stoner humor. Lazo repurposed the antiquated Hanna-Barbera superhero Space Ghost into an outlet for late-night interviews, down to a collection of actual cells from Space Ghost's multiple-decade-old cartoon being used to represent visually this new and more derisive take on the character. This alleviated the need for the financial commitment and creative process of making a whole new character and art for them. Since Space Ghost was one of many Hanna-Barbera characters, Cartoon Network had full access to using. Interviews with Mike Lazo indicate he had one videotape with 90 minutes of Space Ghost characters that he could rearrange and edit to suit his show. That should be an indicator of the paltry funding Cartoon Network could bestow the project, to the point that the original voice of Space Ghost, Gary Owens, was too expensive to reprise his role as intended, leading to the recasting with Georgia radio announcer George Lowe.
I know you're really Batman, but can I call you Adam?
Sure, if you want to blow my cover, Tad.
Although some were disappointed by this development, I do not think we'd have the iconic lampoon of Space Ghost we know today, if not for Lowe. It's often agreed that cartoon characters are their voices, and Lowe's sort of feckless, almost diva-like show host personality led to his performance as Space Ghost was the genesis not just for an infectiously funny character, but to the series' tone that would have huge ripples on Cartoon Network moving forward. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was his intergalactic hub for interviews and hijinks. Space Ghost was accompanied by fellow reused vestiges of his superhero career, subjugated supervillains Zorak and Moltar, both voiced by Clay Martin Croker.
How about I come out at the beginning of every show and hit you upside the head with a hammer
I'd watch that show.
and light your teeth on fire
I do the hammer part. You can do the lighting his teeth on fire part.
What? No, I do the hammer.
I do the
You
hammer.
always do the hammer.
Together, this trio would inquire all manner of celebrities, Tyra Banks to Jack Black to Weird Al Yankovic. The famous faces roped into the show were accosted in real life, face-to-face by a local actor in a Space Ghost costume. The guests' reactions were recorded and rearranged and set to a refined, rewritten, and often fully broken exchange with Space Ghost.
Hey, you guys got a cake.
It's a nice chocolate vanilla.
This plate's right
Hey,
there, but
where'd you guys get that cake? It's my party cake. Where did you guys get my party cake? Who gave them my party cake? That was specifically, definitely for Bobcat and me. Zorak, did you give them my party cake?
Brilliance of this premise is helped by the wide range of reactions you would get from celebrity guests. There was the sort who were kinda in on the joke, the ones who were game but maybe a little confused and reasonably so, the ones who just don't get it, all the way down to the likes of the Bee Gees, who were so amused by the sight of their inquirer dressed as a superhero that they spent the entire junket laughing, resulting in a final edit for their interview on the show being less than a minute long. Celebrity personality meshed surprisingly well with the ego of Space Ghost and the sort of proto-Squidward of Zorak. There were actual character dynamics here, especially as the cast widened a bit, with actors lending the silliest voice they could come up with to old, freakish, alien characters from the 60s. Rounding out the sort of holy trinity of the new Space Ghost universe was Andy Merrill, who lent his voice to a lot of quicker, in-and-out cartoon characters, but created a tone so infectious for the cat warlord Brack that he became something of an early meme.
Welcome to Cartoon Planet, everybody. My name is Brack.
Here's the deal, Brack. I'm the boss. You're nothing. Get it?
Boss of nothing.
What?
Never mind.
Brack would, in later works, be promoted to some extent and sort of supplant Moltar as the third stooge of the Space Ghost industrial complex. I think what really helped him stick was the sort of innocence of the character, adding a necessary sweetness to Space Ghost and Zorak's mutual toxicity, a naive relief if a very silly one. This dynamic really was electric. George Lowe's hysterical narcissism, Zorak's cynicism, and Brack's Brackness bounced off each other like the most rapid-fire game of tennis. Just imagining the fun these three had in the booth together, a huge chunk of the magic of the work surrounding these weird Space Ghost characters.
They don't want to take any chances. The cooking segment is history. Deal with it.
Fine, all right, I'll deal with it. Just have one no question. What am I gonna do with 300 cocktail weenies?
Why don't you eat them?
Me eat them?
Yeah, you eat them.
Well, I'd get sick.
Aha!
Aha, what?
It's all a secret evil ploy to get us all sick.
Coast to Coast sort of ended up being a balancing act between the absurd and the familiar, given its humble means and really solid vocal chemistry between its actors. Everyone remembers how ridiculous this show got, and that's a huge draw, but Space Ghost and his supporting cast were so easily defined by their voices and relationships that another more accessible layer was always present. Space Ghost and Zorak have always felt like fully realized frenemies, despite being sort of stitched together as a hero and villain out of context. They come off as a perfectly combative, odd couple of sorts.
Right, Zorak?
Sidekicks are good at kicking.
Zorak.
May I kick you, John?
Are you serious?
I'll kick your kidneys out and then make a pie with them.
Zorak!
Serve it to you while you're still alive.
You could touch base with personalities this clearly defined when the show fell into utter chaos. It was this unpredictability that Coast to Coast really thrived on. Cartoon Network clearly wasn't precious about Space Ghost as an IP, meaning he could be shown partaking in any manner of strange behavior. The stakes were pretty low because so was the budget. It was reused drawings and celebrity interviews. There wasn't much of a huge loss if it failed. This meant if the writers wanted Space Ghost to fall in love with Fran Drescher, he could. If they wanted him to be supplanted by Macho Man Randy Savage, he could. And if they wanted him to, I'm not shitting you, get so distracted by the sight of a fire ant that he wanders off set and follows it across different backdrops for north of 10 minutes of broadcast runtime, they could do it. If you're uninitiated, you probably think I'm describing some short-lived, lightning-in-a-bottle cartoon I wish more people knew about. But Space Ghost Coast to Coast was kind of a huge success. Media coverage made it clear that it was an acquired taste many public figures were happy to join in on.
Well, do they have trouble getting guests for this show?
They did at the first when guests were figuring out that they weren't sure they wanted to be interviewed by a cartoon superhero, and now apparently they're lining up at the door to
When's it on? When can we see this?
11 o'clock Friday night on the Cartoon Network, which is in about...
I don't know all the ins and outs of showbiz, but I imagine there was no small part of compensation in that the guest stars could also use Space Ghost as an outlet for their own content. The fact that the Ramones could plug their very real new album to almost foreign audiences on Cartoon Network was strong incentive for collaboration, and as a result, mutual financial benefit, not just for said celebrities, but for Cartoon Network, who was also able to fund and rake in money selling toys of the characters and musical albums featuring them.
Hey, everybody! We're partying to our brand new record, Space Ghost Surfing Turf.
22 tiki torch tunes like these.
Mashed potatoes!
Bad bug.
I like bananas because they have no bones.
Zorak's got the blues.
Space Ghost had defied the odds. The low budget, popularity, celebrity buy-in, and high overhead thanks to merchandising meant it altogether came out the other side of its low investment rather profitable, spawning convention appearances aplenty and a ton of hype. Space Ghost had no expectations around it, and no budget, and it was making money. It was basically the best case scenario. This meant Cartoon Network finally had the confidence and resources to roll out a new initiative, the Cartoon Cartoons. 3 years after the debut of Space Ghost, Cartoon Network united creators it had made bonds with via installations like the Cartoonstitute that encouraged pitching and creation of a ton of disparate cartoon ideas from industry veterans and newcomers alike. With the funding and clout Space Ghost trumped up, this lineup of original programming was born, and the long-awaited rivals to the Nicktoons, the Cartoon Cartoons, touched Earth. At last, the once untouchable Nickelodeon crowd met their match. Powerpuff Girls and Courage the Cowardly Dog pushed boundaries of cartoon violence and blending audiences, blurring the lines of genre with unprecedented stories. Cow and Chicken was gross out and loud in an era where Ren and Stimpy were past tense. Ed, Edd n Eddy came from across national borders to introduce an art style and voice cast that was nowhere else in this scape of cartoons. Sheep in the Big City, I guess, is pretty unremarkable, but this was still clearly a paradigm shift. Cartoon Network found its bad boys, its killer app, its breadwinners, and in some ways they struggled to find use for the more financially frugal and aged works that got them there. This was something you could feel a lot in a lot of Cartoon Network's marketing around this time.
What do you think you're doing?
You're doing? No, seriously.
What exactly are you watching? The same thing you watched when you was
a little kid?
That's kind of dumb.
Kind of dumb. When there's something so much better you
could be watching. It's called Cartoon
Friday.
A lot of bumpers and ads for the cartoons were focused pretty geniusly around the idea that the characters were rock stars. The iconoclastic nature of then contemporary cartoons lending themselves well to the idea as we see the cartoons muscle in on new territory, draw in adoring fans, interrogate people as to their authenticity as fans, and just sort of take over the world, sometimes to the chagrin of the cartoons' neighbors on that same network. The classic cartoons, who still had airtime on Cartoon Network, but were looking more and more like red-headed stepchildren. You saw plugs for the cartoon era, where the old-fashioned cartoons interact with the cartoons. The draw of these characters had to be how they push the envelope, how they're so far from your grandparents' cartoons, and there was no better demonstration than showing up those old geezers from the Hanna-Barbera crowd. You saw old-style cartoon heroes needing to escort Double D around a Cartoon Network office, barely stifling his resentment of these new upstarts.
There's a boy on our show who calls his piece of wood plank. What's your piece of wood's name?
Ugh, talk about timing. You're just the man we need. Could you loosen this mic stand? Bravo was in here earlier and he just tightened it and...
The best place for cartoons became the dominant marketing campaign, where we see the Hanna-Barbera characters frequently embarrass themselves in the wake of the new arrivals and, as an extension, the sculpting of the world around them, painted by the cartoons. You saw the Super Friends unaccustomed to sitting down in a movie theater, Fred Flintstone making a fuss over convenience store etiquette, while the stars of Dexter and I Am Weasel have to beat off adoring fans with a stick. The mission statement built up by this campaign was pretty clear. This was the foundation for classic cartoons to gain a new audience, but the cartoons were the heir apparent. This isn't Grandpa's channel anymore. You could have some odd hours here and there to show Jetsons reruns, but prime time belonged to Mojo Jojo, to Johnny Bravo, to the cartoons. And it'd be hard to imagine a brand be so willing to shed its skin and even be a bit derisive to its history this way. But I think this willingness was all thanks to Space Ghost. The way he was hoisted by his own vestiges in such a literal sense that he was represented visually by his old drawings. The way the character pokes fun at his blowhard roots. It was a low-risk experiment that wound up a huge success, and I kinda believe that's what made Cartoon Network comfortable with playful jabs at Yogi Bear from time to time. In fact, it was Space Ghost who was entrusted with introducing these characters to a new generation. Concurrent with Space Ghost Coast to Coast was also Cartoon Planet, a block of retro cartoons introduced in interstitials by Space Ghost, Zorak, and immortalized at this point as the third of this particular trio into Cartoon Network's canon, Brak. And before I forget, there's no reason to cry for Moltar. He got a pretty sweet gig hosting the new block on Cartoon Network devoted to action cartoons and anime, Toonami. I was pretty surprised when I learned this too. Before we ever had the iconic Steve Blum voiced Tom when I was just a baby, we had Moltar bookending reruns of Sailor Moon and Thundercats.
But we brought back a Hall of Famer.
All are assembled at the Hall of Justice.
Sailor Moon will continue to lead off at 4 o'clock.
Don't move! I'm Sailor Moon! We're gonna chew you up and spit you out!
Through to Coast's initial inception, Space Ghost and Friends were thought to be the spoonful of sugar that would help get the pill of more severely retro cartoons down the gullets of younger, less patient viewers. Which is why it may not seem hard to believe that the interstitials featuring the Coast to Coast characters were the most popular aspect, to the point that they eventually just tied all the bumpers and segues made for Cartoon Planet together and assembled them into 22-minute packages and aired them as a TV series all their own.
Well, now, what are Zorak and I going to have for lunch?
Why don't you order a pizza?
They won't deliver up here anymore. Maybe because they don't like being bitten.
Hey, that guy bit me first.
Whatever.
Cartoon Planet was actually my earliest exposure to Space Ghost when I was a kid. And from the start, the vibes were just immaculate. The detailed cartoony backgrounds, the looping animations lent to hyper-savvy voice acting, and comedic timing, the rapid-fire jump-to-jump of the different scenarios, if you can even call them that. The humor that was silly enough for kids, but also weirdly infectious to adults, so when my dad walked in, even he kinda got it. It altogether felt a bit liminal. Like these Hanna-Barbera-era bozos were put out of work for the cartoons, so while those bigger stars hogged the glory, they managed commercial breaks backstage, probably got a little high and shot the shit. It was entrancing, funny, and even kinda cozy that way.
Forehead? Horrid. I would have said forehead Zorhead, or forehead Doorhead, or even forehead Agnes Moorhead, or forehead don't go to the storehead.
Stop it!
Make me!
You're already made, and what a mess!
Why do you always have to be so mean?
As beloved as Cartoon Planet is, as a lodging for Space Ghost and Friends, its days were numbered. The more the cartoons consumed the channel, the Hanna-Barbera-esque characters fit less and less, and were given less screen time. Coast to Coast creator Mike Lazo responded to this by launching Adult Swim in 2001, an alternative block around midnight where Cartoon Network would shift gears into more adult-oriented programming after kids are supposed to go to bed. Keyword being supposed to. We know Adult Swim today is a home for Rick and Morty and Squidbillies, as well as guest swerves from a lot of primetime cartoons and anime, but it started as the zone older cartoon hubs were moved to past 11 p.m. or so. So shows that repurposed Cartoon Network's more retro shorts from Hanna-Barbera to MGM, or perhaps unflatteringly, relegated to funny noise for stoners awake at midnight on a Tuesday. When this time slot was officially christened with the name we know it with today, Space Ghost Coast to Coast was on hiatus. But the DNA of the show was strewn about the starting lineup. We had the Brack Show, which had the clearest connection to Space Ghost.
It was another perfect day. The sky was blue. The grass was green.
Good morning, Sniggle Fritz.
Hello, Mom. Dad.
What?
What do women want?
You're looking at it, little man. Next question.
But it doesn't end there. C-Lab 2021 used stock Hanna-Barbera footage recontextualized and dubbed over, just like Space Ghost, establishing Coast to Coast as something of a trendsetter. Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, is a loose spin-off of Birdman, as he was parodied in Coast to Coast. And even Aqua Teen Hunger Force featured characters that were intended to backdoor pilot with a debut on Space Ghost. Albeit there was a scheduling mix-up that kinda ruined that reveal, but that's kind of a long story. But it is well documented that this was supposed to be the case, that Space Ghost would debut the Aqua Teen characters, who remain fairly prominent in the Adult Swim lineup decades after the fact. These new shows, in an era before the instant transmission of the internet we have today, were sneak peeked and traded at conventions and film festivals alongside the recognizable and reliable face of Space Ghost, drumming up whispers and rumors of strange new Cartoon Network programming long before Adult Swim was even called Adult Swim. No matter how boldly Adult Swim explored different genres and corners of the world of animation that was too hot for Cartoon Network daytime, they were always shepherded by Space Ghost. And it was within these late-night parameters that the already borderline hostile parody of Hanna-Barbera got straight up weird. We learn Yogi Bear in the Space Ghost universe is the devil. Harvey Birdman focused on the titular character legally defending different Hanna-Barbera characters, who the show wasn't afraid to portray as delusional, washed-up has-beens. And commercial breaks were often bookmarked with a segment called Aquaman Dance Party, which,
Yeah. That's the stuff.
Slowly but surely, the lack of unauthorized young viewers meant no rules, at least nominally, and Adult Swim was a safe haven for shows that bewildered me in leaps and bounds when I was a kid way too young to be staying up to watch them. 12-Ounce Mouse, Robot Chicken, Xavier Renegade Angel, all abundant explanations to why my brain is so broken now, and we owe all of this to Space Ghost. He wasn't terribly scandalous at his most famous, but he got everyone gradually comfortable with just admitting that we can point and laugh at Magilla Gorilla, for heaven's sake. We can even put him and his ilk in some strange situations. The people old enough to remember him will laugh at it all the same, especially if we put it in a block kids can stumble upon late at night and enjoy, feeling distinctly like they aren't supposed to. Adult Swim became an army of unique programming in its own right, coexisting with Space Ghost and Brak, both starring in flagship shows, as The Brak Show returned for surprise new seasons alongside new episodes of Space Ghost Coast to Coast. But none of it could last forever. The Brak Show would be canceled on New Year's Eve of 2023, and no bones were made about this to its viewers.
Hello, everybody. They canceled the Brak Show. I'm pretty depressed about it, folks.
You know, my agent at William Morris just laughs at me when I tell him what I do for a living.
In a fashion that grimly strikes me as reminiscent of a parent dying of heartbreak right after their own child, Space Ghost Coast to Coast would only outlive the Brak Show by about 4 months, ending in April of 2004. Little is known about what ended Space Ghost outside the inevitable need for change. Shows come and go, but there's a very telling interview between Mike Lazo and Eric Andre, host of a self-titled Adult Swim show that airs to this day, with a clear surreal influence from Space Ghost. Andre waxes nostalgic about Space Ghost, owning fully the influence that show had on him, to Mike Lazo himself, who replies to the notion of the character ever coming back with the words, "Space Ghost is dead to me." And it may be surprising how cold that comes off, but it's hard to blame the guy. Lazo made history with Space Ghost over north of 100 episodes. Who could blame him for wanting to move on? Even so, we hadn't quite seen the last of Space Ghost and Friends, despite how terminal that response seemed.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Woo, woo, woo.
Sheesh.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody.
That's awful.
Hello, everybody. Woo, woo, woo.
Okay.
Hello,
Okay, I think they've heard
everybody.
enough.
Cartoon Planet. Hello, everybody. Cartoon Planet.
Stop.
There was a short revival in 2012 bestowed to Cartoon Planet, if largely in name only, now hosted by Zorak and Brak, with Space Ghost absent for the time being. Despite the cleaned up, more modern art for the characters, the spirit was largely the same, with our two hosts providing silly interstitials, fully equipped with Andy Merrill reprising his role as Brak, and C. Martin Croker as Zorak once again.
Do you like to watch the classic cartoons?
Cartoons that make you say, man, I haven't seen that in a while.
Well, you're in luck, because that's what we're dishing up and feeding you on Friday nights.
Like a lovely bowl of steaming grits. We're mixing pouches of chowder, Powerpuff Girls, Flapjack, Dexter, and other stuff with milk and popping them in the microwave.
So if you like microwave grits, tune us in. We're hosting.
It's the Brack and Zorak Like Cartoon Show. Cartoon Planet.
Tonight at 8, 7 Central.
On Cartoon Network. For realsies!
Woohoo!
Instead of the old guard cartoon shorts packaged in the original Cartoon Planet, this one was focused on mid to late aughts cartoons that I watched as a kid, and was being presented as retrocore content the same way old Tex Avery shorts were contextualized to me as a kid. Oh boy, if you excuse me, I have a game of bingo to attend to, because I am old as shit. It felt like a warm hug to see these characters reunited, particularly with Meryl and Croker lending their voices again. I keep stumbling over calling them their original voices, because considering both characters are from a 60s superhero cartoon, they're not quite. But it was these voices that sculpted such a particular culture, a moment you were either there for or you weren't, a brand of humor no one has ever replicated. I think no small part of this was the fact that Meryl and Croker were friends, working conventions in the barracks of Cartoon Network's most turbulent days, getting predatory booths kicked out of conventions, and I can only imagine cracking up over improv and hijinks while voicing their versions of Brack and Zorak, alongside George Lowe as Space Ghost. That's what makes this next historic blip hurt kinda bad. 2 years after the curtains closed on the Cartoon Planet revival, C. Martin Croker had died on September 17, 2016, at just 54 years old. Croker wasn't just a voice actor, but an animator on early Coast to Coast as well. Bearing in mind how little content Mike Lazo was licensed to use and remix for a show that was expected to, for a time, carry a network on its back, his additional touch-ups and gestures were invaluable, making him the rare case of a contributor to animation who helped define a character both through his voice and his movements on paper. The versatility of Zorak can't be understated, a perfect foil to Space Ghost in the talk show Lampoon, and one to Brack in the sitcom Lampoon. He was the glue that held both together when the opposite piece was missing. His work as Moltar can't go understated either. Absurdly cheesy as this sounds, him waxing poetic about superheroes in interstitials between episodes of Dragon Ball strikes me as so powerful, even coming from a sarcastic magma alien.
I get lonely sitting here watching the world go by. It'd be nice to have somebody to talk to.
Wonder Woman calling Super Friends.
A friend, a compatriot, a teammate.
I think it's best if we team up. I say we go for it, yes!
Show me a superhero worth their salt.
Hang on, guys. I'm gonna save you no matter what it takes.
I'll show you a support network of friends standing behind them.
United, we're invincible!
Good going, Johnny.
Whether it's the Sailor Scouts, or the Super Friends, or the Dragon Ball heroes.
What a team!
Everybody needs a helping hand.
Hang on.
Even the bad guys know a thing or two about teamwork. We all get by with a little help from our friends.
And we can all be super friends.
And it felt like an essential ingredient to the Ghost Planet formula was gone forever. The absolutely electric chemistry between George Lowe, Andy Merrill, and C. Martin Croker was the evergreen element that brought these characters back from the dead over and over, no matter how much Cartoon Network changed. The trio was dialed into a tone and vibe that was entirely their own, and while minds like Eric Andre and Jason Segel have expressed interest in reviving Space Ghost, I think it would need some heavy retooling to make up for the loss of its main cast and the dynamic they effortlessly put together. Shortly after Croker passed, Toonami acknowledged him in a touching tribute, which aired as a nod to Moltar's initiation of the network block.
Tom?
Yo, what's up?
We have an incoming transmission from, Moltar?
Moltar? Wow, haven't heard from him in a dog's age. What's going on with him?
Well, it's very garbled. I can't seem to decipher all of it.
Alright, listen up.
Dang.
But, here's what I got. Hey, Tom, I've been called back to Moltor and I won't be coming back. There's a mighty oven waiting for me. Just wanted you to know, I always thought I was a better Toonami host than you. Good luck never being able to fill my boots, sucker.
Oh, man. He always did know how to push my buttons.
End message.
Well, fare thee well, buddy. May your oven stay forever lit.
Enter another recent favorite of mine, Jellystone. C.H. Greenblatt of Chowder fame was given the opportunity to make his own take on a shared Hanna-Barbera cul-de-sac of characters, and he took that opportunity to sort of revive the Cartoon Network mentality of mocking those characters at every turn, to hilarious effect. Almost every colorful HB animal was fully reinvented, often at the expense of their antiquated origins. It would have felt like a wasted opportunity not to loop in Space Ghost, and it was in an episode focused on Jellystone's Comic-Con that Space Ghost was brought back, voiced by George Lowe alongside Andy Merrill back once again as Brack. Zorak and Moltar also appeared, voiced now by Jim Conroy and Bernardo De Paula, and both do a pretty terrific job emulating the late Croker's voice for both characters.
Thanks for knitting the costumes, Moltar.
I just like keeping my hands occupied.
We go to Space Ghost's panel.
Yup.
When the time is right, we embarrass him in front of everybody.
Boom, baby!
The narrative and overall tone is different enough from the Space Ghost of yore regardless that it's easy to let any differences in the vocal cast slide. Which isn't to say this episode isn't made with clear love of the Adult Swim era these characters seriously paved the way for. It was very cathartic hearing George Lowe voice Space Ghost for the first time in nearly a decade.
Can we get ice cream on the way back?
Small vanilla cones only. None of that fancy stuff.
Space Ghost's appearances on Jellystone would be his last, voiced by George Lowe, as my little retrospective here brings us in medias res. At the age of 67, George Lowe died while recovering from heart surgery, passing on March 2nd, 2025. I remember pretty vividly, considering it wasn't that long ago, seeing small outlets report on Lowe's passing. George Lowe wasn't the massive scale of celebrity that would have immediate reputable sources reporting on his death the second it happened, to the point that I wondered as I saw headlines claiming he had died if it was all a hoax carried along by internet tabloids, until Andy Merrill posted confirming the development as fact. And it hit me like a truck that Andy was now the last surviving member of the Cartoon Planet trio, the only remaining vestige of Ghost Planet Industries. For those of you wondering, outside of returning to voice Brack here and there, Merrill has shared extensively about making ends meet delivering packages for Amazon. He's been very candid that Cartoon Network has not seen to his continued career in entertainment or compensated him for his work to an extent you would think would be appropriate for how much they owe him. Brack was one of the earliest instances of a cult meme, and the rollout of both Cartoon Network and Adult Swim as we know them would never have happened if not for Space Ghost, Zorak, Moltar, and Brack. And from an artistic, vocal performance, and marketing standpoint, Andy Merrill was a huge part of that. And to see him abandoned with all of that said and done is genuinely really heartbreaking. I feel comfortable sharing this because he's been very outspoken about how much it sucks to work for Amazon, albeit I doubt I had to tell you that. As I work on this video, Andy has stated he's taken a leave from Amazon in hopes of pitching a new creative project. I say that not to stoke what this may or may not have to do with Space Ghost, but to leave a glimmer of hope, because yeah, this was kind of a bummer to leave us on. There'll always be some capital following the man who brought us the singular humor of Brack, even if it's just silent hopes. I'd be supporting Meryl with everything in my power. And as I reach the end of this script, I'm pretty floored by how much I was able to process in it. Space Ghost was always in my big bag of weird interests I could make a video about, but it struck me as a little granular and liminal, and heavier on history than actual content interactions to pull a bunch of interesting analysis from. But here we are, closing out on one of my longer videos in a dog's age, which I put my rear into gear to make because I was so moved by the memory of George Lowe after he passed, and all the joy he brought me as Space Ghost. As tragic as that is, sometimes it takes an unhappy development to really take stock and reflect and realize how much we have to be grateful for. The entertaining minds behind Space Ghost shot for the moon and demonstrably landed among the stars.
Swing your partner round and round and go to town. Now it's time to say goodbye to Zorak and his kid. Thank you folks for kindly doing stuff and dropping in. Have a heap been helping of our hospitality. Lee. Goodbye, 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 everybody.
Continue.